Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the council briefing. I'd like to declare the meeting open at 6:01 p.m. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that tonight we meet on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Just to note that we do have some apologies this evening. We have one council member on approved leave of absence, Susan Gontaszewski, and we have three apologies, Councillor Josh Toppelberg, Councillor Rosalind Harley and Councillor Jimmy Murphy. But we do have a quorum. There are 5 in the House, so we have a quorum, but we don't technically need one for a council briefing, but it's nice to have. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting tonight. Members of the public gallery, if you'd like to come up to the microphone and say a few words, you're very welcome. We do just ask that you state your name, the suburb that you live in and the item. We have none this evening. Okay, so the first item that was raised by a member of the public gallery this evening was item 5.5, which is number 274 Bulwer Street, Perth, proposed change of use from shop, house to restaurant, cafe, unauthorised existing development. And just to explain, because this is a briefing, it's really just a question and answer session between council members and the administration, so there's no debate at tonight's meeting and the decision will be made next Tuesday night. Are there any questions in relation to item 5.5? Councillor Hallett.
Thank you. Through you to the Acting Director of Development Services, or the new title. Just in the report, it referred to the previous use of the site running from around 2000 to 2018 without approval. Just wondering if we've got any current changes to our systems that would avoid us going for 2 decades without knowing that there's an unlisted use operating. And also, do we have any records of complaints over the preceding 18 years in relation to that?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'll just pass on the response to that question to the Coordinator of Development and Design.
Through you, Mayor Cole. So we have no complaints on record from when that use was previously operating. In relation to approvals, it did have all the necessary health approvals. The way that our referral process works is that we flag if there is approvals in the health approval gets referred to the planning team and we note if there is an approval in the system. However, because it was the same business operating for a number of years, there wasn't the requirement for that to occur. But when this operator came to get their new health licence, that's when we flagged that there was no planning approval on record and that they needed to lodge an application. And that's how we would generally capture it. So we wouldn't let it go that long in future, hopefully.
Yep, further question?
And just in relation to, there were some comments about the acoustic report, and just wondering about, in terms of the environmental protection noise regulations, what kind of noise is permissible underneath that and how that would relate to potential for live music, etc., that one of the submitters commented about?
Through the Mayor, the issue with this premises is that it sits within the residential zone, so it's subject to the residential noise regs requirements, which are a little bit less than the commercial ones allow for, which is why our policy requires the submission of the acoustic report for this type of land use, just so that we could anticipate any type of noise that they might generate if they did want to have live music in there, to confirm that it would be compliant, or what they would need to do on those nights if they were going to have a live music in there. Would it mean that they need to keep all of the doors closed and that contained inside? So it would be our preference to get the acoustic report as a condition of the approval, but certainly there is the ability to operate with some reduced noise levels in that location. That's all.
Just to follow up to that one, in relation to the acoustic report, if the applicant advises that they don't wish to have live music in the evenings and that would be then an advice note or condition, would that be an acceptable alternative way forward?
Through you, Mayor. Yes, certainly we can put on an advice note that stated if it's intended for live music to occur at the premises, that they would need to then submit an acoustic report to support that prior to any of those events, and then we could take off that condition.
Okay, could you please discuss with the applicant during the week? Thank you. I also had a question for the Director of Environment and Infrastructure. The speed hump at the front of the cafe, is it one of the rubber air speed humps, or is it a asphalt speed hump? Might not be something that you're aware of. Happy for you to take it on notice.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Thanks for opening the door for that. I'm going to have to take it on notice, and I'll check and put some information in the notes that we distribute.
It's just because I'm aware that the air cushion speed humps can be quite noisy. So if it is, we might need to look at that, particularly if there's al fresco involved. Any other questions on this one, councillors? No? Okay, we'll move on. Thank you. Next item raised was 5.7, which is number 123 Claysbrook Road, Perth, proposed demolition of entire building and like-for-like reconstruction of existing facade and ground floor tenancy, amendment to a current approval. Questions on 5.7? Okay. I did have a few questions on this one. I just wanted to ask in relation to some of the commentary from the design review panel. Heritage specialist talked about this not necessarily being a acceptable approach to conservation, but is more of a design approach. And I just wanted to ask, in terms of the building not being on the MHI, is that, I know that when we took control back from the EPRA scheme, that there was a list of buildings that were on a draft document that were never heritage listed, because we talked about this in relation to the two little character group dwelling on, I can't remember the name of the street, Sheraton. So I just wanted to make, just in terms of this actual building, is it because the heritage value and is not sufficient for it to be on the list, or was it more a technical issue like we've previously had in this area?
Through you, Mayor Cole, in terms of the specifics of 123 Claysbrook Road, I'm not aware of it being further assessed after that area of land was given back to the city. In relation to the Sheraton ones, they have been further assessed and didn't have the suitable requirements to warrant listing them. So if we can take that on notice and we can double check if there was an assessment done and what the results of that were, and provide that in the briefing notes.
And also, it would be good to have a little bit more detail, if possible, on the material use and how, for example, with the existing brickwork, is it intended that a certain proportion of that brickwork will be capable of being reused for the rebuild? Or will it be all like-for-like material that hasn't emanated from the current building?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'll just pass that question on to the Manager of Development and Design.
Through you, Mayor Cole, ultimately there are conditions imposed requiring that to be further considered, because that comes down to how it is dismantled and identifying which materials are capable of being salvaged and reused. Therefore, I'm not sure how much more detail and specificity we can provide at this point, but there are conditions requiring that assessment to be undertaken prior to any works commencing.
Okay, I guess it would be good to know, if possible, at this stage, whether it's going to be a demolition or whether it's going to be a dismantle, where the bricks are trying, where there's a sort of concerted effort to salvage as much material as possible, or whether it's a demolition, if that sort of high-level information is able to be provided. Thank you. Any questions on this item? Okay, thank you. Next item is 5.1. Number 496 Charles Street, North Perth, change of use to unlisted use, car wash and detailing. This is an amendment to an approved operating hours. Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor. First one, just a clarification around the hours of operation. Will the city be following up with the applicant just to confirm that those amended hours that was just discussed by the applicant?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, we'll follow up with the applicant following the briefing session and clarify the hours of operation that are being sought.
My second one's a bit of a technical one around the noise assessment. So my understanding is that we've got two sources of noise, being the vacuum and the washdown, being one being at 41 decibels, the other being at 45, and we basically take that decibel reading and assess that against a thresholds around 10%, 1% and 0%. And to my read of the report, in one case we meet the 10% hurdle, and in the second case the vacuum plus wash down is assessed against the 1% hurdle. And I was just wondering, is that because we start with the 10% and then progress to the 1% if they don't meet the 10% hurdle? Or is it, like, how do we decide which is the hurdle we assess against? I realise that's a very specific question.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I might just pass on to the Coordinator of Development and Design.
Through you, Mayor Cole, we'll have to get some information from our health team about that. It's probably a little bit too technical for me.
That's fair enough. The second one was around the site orientation, and given the sources of noise, they seem to be orientated towards the back of the development, which is also where the neighbours are, the closest neighbours are located. So was there any discussion about alternative ways of orientating those specific sites, the vacuum location and the washdown location, so that those noisier activities were more fronting towards the front onto Charles Street?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the application doesn't propose any modification to the existing site layout, so all that's shown in the on the site plan is already existing and already approved as part of the previous application. There wasn't any ability to reconsider that because that's not because we're only looking at the extension to the hours of operation.
And I also note that under the current assessment, there's no mitigations proposed for the sound, for the noise that's produced, but if in the future a sound assessment demonstrates that is exceeding it, then there's a condition requiring mitigation to be installed. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole. Yes, the current approval doesn't have any conditions relating to the management of the noise factors on site. It's proposed, if council were to consider this extension, that we would impose a condition for a management plan which requires compliance with the acoustic report and also ongoing management review every 12 months so that we could mitigate against any issues that arise in that time.
So the acoustic report doesn't require any mitigations currently, so they're not actually required to do anything at the moment, but we will then be doing this acoustic report every year, and if that then subsequently demonstrates that it's exceeding the thresholds, then mitigations would need to be introduced.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct. The current report doesn't require any mitigation measures to be installed because it's determined that the noise sources on site are compliant with the noise regulations. The condition that's recommended does require compliance with noise management measures, and if that was shown, if it was shown there was continued breaches of the noise regulations, then that would require review and mitigation measures.
And just following on from the question raised from the gallery by the neighbour, it was mentioned about non-compliance with the current hours of operation. Can you just provide some feedback around how that is considered or not in this process, and what would be the appropriate avenue for following up around that as well?
Through the chair, the city was alerted to non-compliance with the hours of operation and invited the application on the proviso that the applicant ceased operating outside of the those approved hours until the application was reconsidered by council. If the adjoining neighbour is experiencing a breach to that current approval, then they can contact the city's compliance services and we can investigate that until this application is determined they're required to comply with their current approval.
And what are the consequences if they do not comply with the conditions of approval?
Through the Mayor, if they're non-compliant with their current conditions of approval and continue to do so, so the first avenue is to invite an application, which is the process that we're currently going through. If the application's not successful and we continue to see non-compliance, then the City can take prosecution action.
Councillor Fotakis.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to the officers. A similar question, just how many complaints have we had over the history of that? I noticed that it was actually mentioned in some of the comments on some of the submissions that were given.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'd have to check that and confirm in the briefing notes the number of complaints.
Through you, Mayor, just on there's a number of other businesses, similar businesses that are operating nearby, other parts of the city as well. Can we get an indication of what their approved opening hours are, and whether approval of this, of extending the hours, has implications of flow-on effect on obviously implying that those other businesses can follow suit?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's something that we can provide in the briefing notes.
Councillors, just to reiterate what we've heard from the applicant tonight is that the hours being sought on Saturday are 8:30 to 5 p.m. and on Sunday 9 to 5, which is actually a reduction in the current approved hours. So if you could just discuss that with the applicant during the week, that would be much appreciated. And just in relation to water runoff in the right-of-way, is there, just in terms of complaints, or if there's been any inspections by the city that would, is there an issue with the water management on site with runoff?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I don't believe that we've seen any runoff issues on site. It may have been an issue with their on-site soak wells containing that, but we can look into that and confirm if anything's required.
Thank you. No further questions? Okay. The next item raised was 5.6, which is number 66 Lindsay Street, Perth, proposed 6 multiple dwellings. Questions? Dan Loden, Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to clarify the plans show a solar array on the roof of the development, and under, I guess, current built form policy, that's not conditioned to my understanding, but is included in the development. How is that outcome achieved, or do we have any ability to ensure that outcome, or is it just if it's there and they choose to do it, then that's great?
Through you, Mayor Cole, ultimately that forms part of the development proposal, so whatever's shown in the plans would be what we approved, if that's the decision made by council. In addition, the applicant also submitted a environmentally sustainable design report, accounts for a number of different measures, this included, so that will be further explored at the building permit stage, but ultimately if it's shown in the development plans, that's what we'll be approving.
So assuming council approves this next week and the development's built, if solar panels are not installed on the roof, that would be considered a non-compliance?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that would be my understanding, yes.
Councillors? Councillor Loden? Oh, sorry, Councillor Hallett.
Just in relation to the condition for the bicycle bay, it's got kind of an alternative condition that in the situation that an on-site location is not suitable, that cash in lieu of 400 would be payable. Can you just outline what admin's intention would be for that money?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, there's an alternative. So administration's view is that there is a bike store provided on the ground floor that would be capable of providing not only the 3 long-term bicycle bays but also the 1 short-term bay. The condition is framed to say that if that is not the case, if that's not possible, then that cash in lieu would contribute towards the provision of a bike rack directly in front of that premises in the verge, in a location that would be detailed and agreed upon by the city in installing that.
Thank you. And just in relation to the 12 parking bays with a minimum of 2 car bays per dwelling, can I just confirm that that was came from the applicant and wasn't a requirement of the city in terms of being such an inner city location having that many parking bays?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that was proposed by the applicant.
Councillors, I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Councillor Gondaszewski because I know that she would ask this question, and it's about visitor parking. I note there is an oversupply of parking in the building, but that there is no allocated visitor parking, but there is some discussion about visitors being sort of invited in to use the car bay with the adjoining residents. Is that something that we're able to condition in terms of, I mean, I don't really see a way that it could be, but just this notion of moving away from visitor car parking, I think this is something that the council has been quite keen to protect.
Yeah, sure. Through you, Mayor Cole. Ultimately, I'm not sure if we're moving towards or moving away from the provision of visitor base. Ultimately, it's just a different configuration. There's still going to be opportunity for visitors to be parking on site. It just won't be dedicated for visitors. I think that provides a better opportunity to be a bit more flexible with residents as well as accounting for visitor demand. Nonetheless, there is a condition that has been recommended by administration, condition number 3, regarding an access management plan, and the purpose of that is to detail those management measures to ensure that it is available at all times for visitors and how that actually works on ground.
Thank you very much. Councillors, any further questions? Okay, we'll move on. The next item raised was 5.3. Number 110 Coogee Street, Mount Hawthorn, proposed 3 group dwellings. Questions? Councillor Castle?
Through you, Mayor Cole, just a couple of questions that arose from the gallery. There was a comment made about a miscalculation on the vegetation on the canopy coverage on the report. Can you give us some information on that?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'm not aware of any errors in the calculation from administration in regards to canopy coverage or deep soil areas, but I'm happy to take that on notice and revisit that calculation.
Thank you. There was also some concerns raised from the gallery around the lot setback and the incompatibility with the streetscape. Can you just give us some more feedback on why the report considers those things to be acceptable?
Through you, Mayor Cole, this was raised during community consultation. Ultimately, I believe the concern relates to the frontage for Coogee Street. Now, predominantly along Coogee Street, that's the primary frontage for most of those, or for the majority of those dwellings. Given that this is a corner lot, the applicant has proposed secondary street frontage onto Coogee Street. That means that they are permitted to have a reduced street setback down to 1.5 metres. On that basis, I can understand concerns from adjoining residents that is a reduced street setback compared to primary street setbacks for other dwellings existing along Coogee Street. So this administration's view is that it satisfies the deemed to comply requirement based on secondary street setbacks, but ultimately that is the concern in terms of how it does present to that street for Coogee. In saying that, the applicant has set back the garage further than required. I think it's 3.9 metres in lieu of the 1.5 metres to account for that. And there is that articulation along that frontage as well, so it's not just set back at one length.
Thank you. And the other question was around the streetscape and how it fits with the existing streetscape and the height and stories that are currently along that strip of.
Through you, Mayor Cole, the height itself, you're permitted to build to 2 stories. Now, initially, when the application was submitted, it did propose a 3-story component. Through iterations of the plans, that has come down to 2 stories, so that is consistent with the building height that is permitted within that area, acknowledging that it's predominantly single-storey residents along Coogee Street. However, along Woodstock, there's prevalence of double-storey, so it's not incompatible, I guess, from that regard. In relation to the way it presents, administration did have concerns initially based on the streetscape, existing streetscape and the proposal itself. It was the view that it would benefit from input from the design review panel. So ultimately, there were 2 further iterations of the plans, and we worked closely with the design review panel. That's covered in page 82 of the report. That basically details the DRP's comments and their concerns. The design review panel chair suggested that there might be some improvements around the colours and materials and picking up on what is prevalent in the streetscape. Subsequently, modifications were made, primarily to the Coogee Street frontage, but again, relating to colours and materials and some articulation, setting the upper storey back. And ultimately, the plans that were proposed, and that's before you, reflect those recommendations from the DRP chair. So that has gone through a rigorous exercise, and administration is satisfied that all of the comments raised by the DRP chair in regards to the design is reflected in the plans.
Councillors. Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor. Just some questions around trees. So we have one verge tree being removed on the Coogee Street side of the development, but there's no, and in the report it refers to additional trees going into the verge on, I can't remember the name of the street, the one that's not Coogee Street. Woodstock, geez, it's right next to my house as well. Anyway. In the report, it refers to these additional trees. Are they conditioned? They don't appear to be conditioned, though. I was just wondering how we ensure those trees would be planted in the verge.
Through you, Mayor Cole, so I confirmed there is one tree being proposed to be removed from the Coogee Street verge to allow for that vehicle access. That tree itself is a sapling. It's probably about 15 centimetres in height. So ultimately the city's parks team were of the view that it's something that could be supported, noting that they are proposing on their landscaping plan 3 additional verge trees. I agree, it is not reflected in the conditions recommended by administration. That's something that we can address before council meeting next week, but nonetheless it is reflected on their landscaping plan, so that shouldn't be an issue.
And that's quite a long stretch because it's I think it's about 40-metre stretch there. I mean, obviously there's 2 vehicle crossovers in that section as well. How many trees are proposed to fit in there, and how many trees could potentially fit in that site?
Through you, Mayor Cole, sorry, could you please clarify that question?
So on the Woodstock side, it's a 40-metre length roughly, I think, for the development there. And you've got 2 vehicle crossovers that are going into 2 of the townhouses. One of the townhouses, one on the corner, has got its access from the rear via Coogee Street. So given that length of space, there would appear to be an opportunity to put a number of trees in there, which helps to break up the bulk of the development. How many trees realistically could we fit in there?
Through you, Mayor Cole, thanks for clarifying, Councillor Loden. There's 2 existing verge trees that will be retained along Woodstock Street. There have been 3 trees that have been identified as being capable of being planted along Woodstock Street, and that's again having regard for the spacing and the rhythm of other verge trees along Woodstock Street as well. So that was referred to our parks team, and that was supported. Happy to consider that further if there's any additional opportunity for verge tree planting.
So by my math, that would add up to about 5 trees along that span.
Councillors? Sorry, no, but we can accept emails from you during the week, etc. But this meeting, public question time's finished, but I'm happy to speak to you during the week or to receive emails during the week. Yep, thanks. In relation to the secondary street setback, is council, in terms of the policy where you're reorientating housing away from the traditional set street frontage to a side, does that mean that council must, you know, in terms of actually under policy, must we treat the traditional front facing streetscape as a side setback?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's available to the applicant to propose. So ultimately, that would Coogee Street would, yes, form the secondary street frontage.
Okay, so then does that then mean that we must treat Coogee Street as the secondary street frontage, despite the fact that there could be an impact on the way in which the flow of that street setback works, given that it's traditionally been the front, the main street, but now it's been treated as a side setback, a secondary street rather, is what I'm trying to say.
Sure. Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. Though it is technically, as far as the planning assessment goes, a secondary street, that doesn't mean that it needs to present any lesser. So ultimately, the design outcome is what is important here, and that was absolutely taken into account when we were assessing the proposal. There's some perspectives. Page 119 shows how it has been treated, and it's not dissimilar to the primary street.
No, I can absolutely see that. My question really is around how far forward is it of the small cottage next door?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's approximately 6 metres to the veranda of the cottage next door. The garage is proposed at 3.9 metres.
Thank you. Also, just in relation to the question raised about eaves on the west, I just thought I would raise that because whilst I think that the elevations have all been treated over the iterations of plans received, the west does remain quite blank, and I know that, you know, that's on a right-of-way, but the issue of the eaves and, you know, the fact that that will be catching the full sun, is that something that could be, that you could provide any advice on or discuss with the applicant?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, happy to discuss with the applicant.
And just finally, I noted in the report it talked about driveway width. I'm just making sure I've got this right. It talked about the fact that it's 9 metres is the standard and that it's 11.8. Is that correct?
Yes, Mayor Cole, that is accounting for the 2 driveways along Woodstock Street and for the one on Coogee Street in total.
Why? I'm just interested. Is it an extra large garage, or is it why is it wider than the standard?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's because there's 3 driveways. Ultimately, it's accounted for, trying to achieve a scenario where you have minimised driveways. But if you've got 3 dwellings with 3 separate driveways, I guess that does mean the total or the aggregate is going to exceed that permitted, because that 9 metres is typically for a single dwelling. However, you've got a scenario where you've got 3 group dwellings.
Okay, thanks for that. Are any further questions? Okay, thank you. Next item raised by a member of the public gallery was 5.4, number 381, Beaufort Street, Perth, car park addition to lodging house. Councillor Loden.
Just the question from the applicant there around the timing issue. Is the city able to provide a response just to that request that was made?
Through you, Mayor Cole. Yes, we can amend the condition that's in there. We had altered it from our standard condition, but we can amend it back to the standard condition, which is for your reference in item 5.3, condition 10 on page 78, which talks about the owner entering into a legal agreement with the city secured by a caveat on the titles to ensure that that amalgamation proceeds. Because our biggest concern at the moment is that those lots may be further split off those titles and sold, and we would have no ability to intervene in that. So if we revert the condition to include the requirement for them to enter into a caveat until that amalgamation's occurred, then the city would be notified as a party to that caveat if one of those lots was to be sold. So that's fine.
And the city will do that. Great.
Any further questions? Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just a follow-up to that. So if we revert to that standard clause or condition, does that actually remove the timeframe altogether?
Through you, Mayor Cole, what we will do is, because that standard condition talks about within 12 months of the issue of a building permit, which potentially is not required for these works, we'll still say them entering into a legal agreement within 90 days. We would still like to proceed with that section of it within 90 days of the approval. And we will confirm with the applicant that that's going to be sufficient time.
Any further questions on 5.4? Okay, no. Okay, that was the last item raised by a member of the public gallery this evening, so we'll go through and deal with the items that we have not yet asked questions on in their order. So the next item is 5.2, which is number 43 Chatsworth Road, Highgate, proposed alterations and additions to a single house. This is an amendment to approval and extension to the period of approval. Any questions on this one? No. Okay. The next item is 5.8, amendment to policy number 7.5.1, minor nature development. Any questions? I have a question. I just want some absolute clarity that we're looking at Beaufort Street between Walcott and Bulwer.
Through Mayor Cole, yes, that's my understanding, and should be shown on the map that's included in attachment 1.
I did see the map, but it was a bit difficult to read, so I just wanted to be absolutely crystal clear.
Yep.
Also, I just wanted to give you a scenario and see what would happen, because we are being very liberal here with uses, which is very exciting. But what would happen if we had requests for a motor vehicle wash, motor vehicle repair, a service station, warehouse storage or transport depot?
Through Mayor Cole, I guess in terms of the current building footprints that are existent on Beaufort Street would be, like those types of uses would require works to be taken to occur on the lot to enable them to happen. So this proposed amendment to the policy only looks at the uses, and if works are required for all of those examples or other examples that may be trying to make permanent changes to the facade along Beaufort Street, then they would no longer be exempt and they would require the approval of the city.
That's great. And just in relation to parking, that's something that whatever's on site is what is there and that is it, and there's not going to be cash in lieu required for while we have this in place. Is that the case?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct. So this is essentially exempting uses that are temporary for a period of up to 12 months. So it's not linked to parking requirements or any other requirements of the city. It's just saying that if you want to conduct that use for a period of up to 12 months, then you wouldn't require the approval of the city. You're able to conduct the use.
Fantastic, thank you. Any other questions? No? Thanks. The next item is 5.9, Outcomes of Advertising Amendment 1 to Local Planning Policy Number 7.11, Built Form, Effective Design WA, and Initiation of Amendment 2 to Built Form Policy. Any questions? Councillor Loden?
Thank you, Mayor. I know there was a briefing provided to some council members. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend, so you'll have to persevere with my questions. I do appreciate the 800 pages that you sent through to us. The first one is, I guess, clarifying my understanding of how this... So we've got planting areas and deep soil zones. You've got each planting area has to be at least 3% in size in terms of the lot area, and then the deep soil zones determines the total area of planting that needs to happen. Is that the correct way to think about it?
Through you, Mayor Cole, so the development would be required to provide 12% deep soil area and 3% planting area, so a total of 15% over the site.
Yep, okay. Great. Then we've deleted the landscaping and plan landscaping plan and the schedule for landscaping out of Volume 1, but those conditions are in Volume 2 and Volume 3. So we're using that mechanism to place those requirements for multi-res developments and commercial developments, and addressing that separately for the residential side of things. Is that the correct way to interpret it, or for the single dwelling and group dwellings?
Sorry, if I can just clarify the question through you, Mayor Cole. You're asking if we require a landscaping plan to be provided for, like a different type of landscaping plan to be provided, whether it's residential or mixed use or multiple dwellings? Is that the question?
Yes, so we've deleted it's C 1.7.4 and 5, which had requirements that you must have a landscaping plan and a schedule for that. The feedback was that was, and I'm possibly getting confused around in my versions here as well, removed because that's too onerous a requirement for single dwellings and group dwellings, but we then have separately included into Volume 2 and Volume 3 requirements for a landscaping plan, and then that's a condition and that's how we enforce that condition for multi-res and for commercial.
Through you, Mayor Cole, without wanting to spend a long time flipping through all of the different versions, I will confirm, but my understanding is that if the development is proposing, it's a brand new development that's residential, and there's a substantial landscaping component, then the city would be able to require a landscaping plan, whether that's a single house, group dwelling, multiple dwelling, commercial development, mixed use, that we would determine at the time of lodgement whether that a landscaping plan would be required, and I'd say in most instances it would be, but I'll confirm that that's what is reflected in the provisions of the policy.
Thank you. On the topic of garage width, we now have a provision that it must be less than 50% or 4 metres if less than a 10 metre wide block. I want to just... We don't have any 8 metre or less wide blocks, do we?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I might have to take that one on notice just to confirm if we have any lots in the city that are less than 8 metres frontage. There may be a number of them, anomalies. I think on average they're about 10 to 12 at the lower range. So that provision is really intended to ensure that the garage isn't dominating the frontage for those narrow width lots.
But if there were lots that were less than 8 metres, they'd still need to meet the 50% provision anyway, yes?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct.
There's a section around universal design, which has an objective in there that talks about accessibility for people with disabilities, but there's not to my read, anything further than that. So what is that aimed at? What will that achieve in terms of a design outcome?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the accessible design provisions are really intended to address situations in town centres where we're wanting to make sure that we still maintain a positive streetscape in terms of the design of the development while still enabling universal access. So that's what those provisions are really intended to include. There's also Australian standards for universal access, and so they're not repeated in the policy. The intent of the provisions that are included is really to ensure that the design of the building and how it addresses the street is maintained while also allowing for universal access, but not to kind of create new standards or anything like that.
And my last one's just around environmentally sustainable design. So we've now rejigged this, and there's no deemed to comply conditions. There's principles that talk to different standards that you can measure against for either 5 Green Star or achieving 50% or 25% reduction in greenhouse global warming potential, depending on the development, and also similarly water efficiency measures. That to me reads pretty similar to the provisions that we had. They're all basically the same? Is that correct?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. Essentially, the provisions are. So we've been on a bit of a journey with these provisions in terms of what's in the policy at the moment, which requires people to demonstrate that they're able to achieve the environmentally sustainable design requirements that are set out. The intent is that we then moved away from that, and we're trying to ensure that developers were actually required to deliver those outcomes. But I guess in the further research that we've done, we've identified this inconsistency with the Building Code of Australia and not being able to require applicants or developments that to actually achieve those standards. So we've essentially gone back to what we had originally proposed in Amendment 1, being that developers will demonstrate to the city that they can achieve the environmentally sustainable design requirements that are in the policy. Just to add, that's for residential development. In volumes 2 and 3 of the Amendment 2 to the policy, which apply to apartment development and mixed-use commercial development, they are included as acceptable standards. So there's just a slight difference in, I guess, where they sit in the policy and what the type of provision is. So as a result of Design WA, we now have those acceptable outcomes in the volume 2 and 3 of the policy.
So on that acceptable outcome terminology, so if an application comes forward and meets that acceptable outcome and then is built, if it has not, if say for example, we'll use solar panels as an example, if they're proposing to install hyper solar panels and then they don't, would that then be a breach?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's not dissimilar to the application that we were looking at before that proposed the solar panels, where if they're shown on the plan, then that's what should be delivered in theory. In terms of the status of the acceptable outcome, that's one way of achieving the objective. Sorry, I can't remember the correct element objective. The assessment that gets undertaken is more performance-based, so it's looking at does the development achieve the overall element objective, and then the acceptable outcome is just one way or one method of potentially achieving that, which we've provided guidance on what the city's view would be in terms of meeting that acceptable outcome, but there could be a whole range of different ways that could be achieved. It's just really looking at whether the development achieves the element objective.
And so the typical way that an applicant would do this is by doing a report, I guess, an assessment report or a life cycle analysis report. They might not show solar panels specifically on their design, but they have a report that's attached to the application. If they don't deliver on that, do we then have a mechanism to enforce that or not?
Through you, Mayor Cole, if it forms part of the approval, then the city would potentially have an avenue to ensure compliance.
Do you mean that we would have to have a condition there that said that they would execute the elements in that plan?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I guess it could be through a condition or I guess the overall package of plans and subsequent informing information that the council approves, that all forms part of the approval. So if that was in their ESD report and the ESD report forms part of the approval and or was conditioned, then that would be the potential avenue.
So if the ESD report was attached to the development application that's submitted to council, and we then approved that ESD report, that application with that ESD report, then that would be a valid basis for taking compliance action if it was not implemented?
Potentially, yes. It would just, the only conflict would be if that's not included in the building approval, and the building approval is what sets the standards for environmental sustainable design in regards to energy. So we couldn't require that the ESD report be included as part of the approval. If someone happened to do that, then that could be a potential avenue. I don't have any knowledge of where that's been tested in the tribunal, but it's something that we could look into in terms of whether we could require conditions and require that ESD report is provided as part of the approval. Then if it's in conflict to the Building Code of Australia and the requirements that are in there, if it's above and beyond that, then we wouldn't really have a basis to take compliance action.
So if when the applicant got to building stage, submitted their building application to the city, if the ESD report was not attached, then it would not be a condition of the building approval and they could build what was submitted at the building stage?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I mean, it really depends on what's included in the ESD report, because if it is something like solar panels that are shown on a plan and shown on the development approval, then there's a potential avenue. If it's other elements such as lighting fixtures or water fixtures, then they wouldn't be shown on the development approval, so wouldn't really have a basis to take compliance action. And at the building stage couldn't require that ESD report is provided as a requirement above and beyond what is already needed to be submitted as part of their building approval, building application.
And then a challenging one. So we've had these provisions in one form or another for a while now. Do we have any idea what percentage or how many of the developments that have been approved since this has been in place that have had these provisions included in some, or have had to do an ESD report, how many of them have actually been constructed with those items included into the development?
Through you, Michael, I might take that one on notice and check in our reporting statistics.
I recognise there's a time lag associated with it as well, so it's probably not something we know a clear answer on for a while yet anyway.
Councillors, questions on built form policy? Acting Director, I wanted to ask, in the report, it talks about the suite of new provisions to identify key design elements and require that they incorporated into the proposed development. It's such a long attachment. I haven't been able to locate where those provisions are. I'd just like to go through them before next Tuesday. Could you do you know what page number I'll locate them on?
Through Michael, sorry, I don't know the page number off the top of my head. I can pull them out and note the specific clause numbers for the next week. And I guess if you would like, I can go through them now in terms of the concept or the...
the main thing is I'm kind of going through this and thinking of some of the issues that we've experienced in development applications, and I'm looking to those to see whether I feel like that would satisfy some of the issues we've been dealing with. So I'm happy to do it during the week. If maybe you could just email me where to find that. That'd be very good. And just in terms of that, thinking through some of the issues that we have been dealing with, Some things that have come up recently are things like retrofitting, the ability to retrofit car parks and the floor-to-ceiling levels in car parks, whether that's something that we feel that this policy can deal with. I think on-structure landscaping is probably captured already, but just in terms of, because through landscaping plans, etc., but just in terms of, having on-structure planting that's viable and that will live for, and continue to. Other things around eaves, I think that, particularly in the residential area, lack of eaves on houses is something that is quite common with a lot of construction that we're seeing. And also just interested in terms of activation of right-of-ways in town centres. That's something that's also been coming up a little bit more recently as well.
Through you, Mayor Cole, perhaps I can take those on notice and provide some information in the briefing notes.
Yeah, but I'm also thinking that the other issue that we're talking about in terms of those more design guidelines would really be trying to satisfy some of the other issues that we've been dealing with, like interaction with the street, etc.
Through you, Mayor Cole. So as a result of implementing the policy and having it tested a couple of times through the State Administrative Tribunal, we've tried to embed the learnings from those decisions into policy provisions that we feel will go some way to address the design issues that we are consistently coming up against, and try and provide some clarity both for decision makers and applicants and community members on what's expected from a design perspective. So that's certainly what our provisions are seeking to achieve, and hopefully will achieve. But I guess it's an iterative process, and once we've actually had a chance to implement these provisions, if the policy does get adopted, we will certainly continue to update them as we go and we learn more about design.
Thank you. I'm also assuming it's going to be dealing with monotonous facades, excessive amounts of render. Yep, okay, good. Are there any further questions on the built form policy? Okay. That concludes planning and place items for this evening. Infrastructure and environment's having a night off tonight. Wait, there might be questions in the info bulletin. I'm sure we can. I've already asked you about a speed hump, so don't go anywhere just yet. Community and Business Services item 7.1, investment report as at 30th of June 2019. Any questions? Okay. 7.2, late report, authorised expenditure for the period 1st to 30th of June 2019. Any questions? Late report 7.3, financial statements as at 30th of June 2019. Councillor Loden.
Your comment to the Director was timely. I note the capital works spend for at year end for 30th of June was a little bit short of what we were proposing in the budget, and I was just hoping to get an update on. There was a brief conversation over the weekend, but I couldn't find the relevant information just around what's happening with that remaining infrastructure spend.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I might just start before I hand over to the Director of Infrastructure and Environment. So there's two parts to the capital work shortfall. A big chunk of it does relate to IT, so it isn't all infrastructure and environment projects. So I might just touch on that first. Those IT projects are being rolled over. I don't have the exact figure, but it is a significant portion. And the second thing I might add is that we're still finalising. These are only provisional figures at this stage, so we're still finalising that. And that will obviously come to Council in August with the final numbers, and they will be different because there has been quite a few purchases that have gone through in the last few weeks before the end of the month, and they will be reflected in the final numbers that come through to Council in August.
Through you, Mayor Cole, if I add to that, just to echo those comments, because this is a provisional report, it doesn't show some of the expenditure in the last month or so. And also the figure, the shortfall, doesn't include commitments. So, for example, 2 waste trucks that have been ordered, the money is committed, but it's shown as a shortfall because the money isn't actually spent until we don't actually hand over the money till we get the trucks. So I think you'll find the Capital Works programme has, there's a figure there of around 5 million. You can see that at least 2 million committed. Now, when we finalise the accounts this year, you'll see there's quite a bit more spend that's been carried out in the last month, and the position will be significantly better than that. And again, if you look at the report, the Capital Works programme, you'll see a high number of projects completed, sort of in the 90% mark. So it's actually been a good year for infrastructure.
And just in terms of that report, so the next meeting will end up with a revised July report as well as an August report.
Through you, Mayor Cole, in August, my understanding is you will receive the end of year numbers as well. August, September. I won't commit to the date. It'll be after the auditors have gone through our books and we've addressed all the auditors' questions, finalised the books to their satisfaction, and we'll provide those to council, and that'll come to council in a council report.
Just for my understanding of the financial systems here, so you mentioned the ICT project that's now being carried over. Does that then get added onto the top of the Capital Works budget so we've got an existing approved Capital Works budget in the budget now, then that gets added onto the top of it now, and then that'll be accounted against over the course of the next year?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct.
Councillors, no further questions? Okay. Well done, Director. Nice sea change. Yeah. Okay, Chief Executive Officer items. First of all, 8.1 Information Bulletin. Councillor Loden.
Just on the development application statistics, there are a few that are beyond 90 days listed there. I was just wondering how many are any of them from the 2018 calendar year, or have we closed out all of the items from 2018? And also, is there any from the 2017-18 financial year, so like effectively a year old?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I believe that there are no applications from the 2017-18 financial year. I think there is a very small number of applications from the 2018 calendar year, of which I think one is going to council this round to be determined. I'm pretty sure, but I will check if there's any from the 2018 calendar year.
Anyone got a joke? No, we're not waiting on any information. Oh, I thought you were getting something for Councillor Loden. You're adding it to the notes. Okay, I just thought we were killing time. What is she talking about? Does anyone have any other questions? Councillor Vatakis.
No, thank you, Mayor. Attachment 4, the Register of Tree Removals. Through you, Mayor, to the Director. I just want to, we seem to actually we've got a very efficient way of actually collecting the data, but I haven't seen a report that's come through with so many trees in the 1 month. So I just want to really check, and we've got a number of these trees as confirmed dead. Do we have an idea about how many of those are from malicious damage? Is it because of, I suppose we suffered quite a severe drought over last summer, and I just want to check that we are using our tree tool for the replacement species, because I notice that there's quite a high portion of jacarandas in on that list of replacement trees.
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole. The list is a little bit longer than normal. I think from looking at the list, and I'll check this with the Supervisor of Parks, you can see that we've obviously done some sort of survey of street trees. Normally the list is mostly focused on public inquiries about trees, but you can see the supervisor's obviously examining some of the trees and found quite a few that are dead. So he's probably just done that at the end of the financial year, but I'll check that. And we do use a street tree selection tool, but I'll look into why jacarandas are being used in larger numbers than anticipated.
Any other questions on the info bulletin? Okay. That takes us to item 8.2, Draft Sustainable Environment Strategy and Implementation Plan 2019 to 2024, Public Consultation Outcomes. Councillor Hallett.
Thank you. Just wondering if we can get a copy of the survey instrument in the briefing notes.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes.
And just also in the report, there's some references to future amendments to the SES or implementation plan once other departments have been consulted, but we're being asked to approve the draft. I'm just wondering how that's going to work.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just to clarify, is the question about how we would seek council endorsement of the final implementation plan?
And the strategy, because there's some comments in response to submission commentary that admin somewhat agrees and will, with consultation, add some additions to the both of the documents in the future. And so just wondering how long that will take and what that means for us approving the documents as they stand.
Through you, Mayor Cole, we're seeking council to adopt the strategy, but to note implementation plan, because we want to ensure that we can keep the implementation plan a live document, which we add actions, which we may not be able to identify now, but opportunities as they arise, and we can have regular reporting back to council on the additions and the changes to those implementations plans over the next few years and through the Environmental Advisory Group.
Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor. There was a meeting with Beaufort Street Network yesterday and some discussion around that the suggested changes to the Sustainable Environment Strategy. One of the suggestions was to basically include an executive summary that pulls out some of the key actions, and I believe administration is proposing to add an additional item in to say that an executive summary will be included. I'm just wondering if there's the potential for council to see a draft of that circulated via email or something like that prior to the meeting next week.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just to clarify, is the question whether council can see the draft executive summary before the council meeting next Tuesday.
You can take it on notice.
I'll take that on notice because we want to make it a particularly good one. We also will be seeking a forward from the Mayor for the document as well. So some of those items, there would be usually a few weeks in preparing the final publication, ensuring that the executive summary syncs with the Mayor's forward. We can certainly circulate that document if not before, certainly after the council endorsement of the draft strategy, because the intent of that executive summary and some of the formatting changes would not be to change any of the substance of the strategy and the targets, but just to make sure it's easily accessible to the general public when they're reading it and have a summarised version. So I could certainly undertake to share that document afterwards. Thank you.
On the consultation process, so there was a probably longer than normal consultation process on this which closed on the 4th of July, and then there were a few late submissions in that as well. Timing wise, did that make it a bit difficult because the report gets released on the 11th of July to incorporate any feedback that's received?
Through you, Mayor Cole, there was a good level of responses and a high level of interest, which was positive. We thought most of the comments could be easily accommodated through normal business and actions, which don't necessarily require changes to the targets or some of the settings which council endorsed in the draft strategy. A lot of it was very valuable feedback. It won't be lost if it didn't result directly in an editing change to that draft document. We've got very dedicated sustainability officers. They went through it line by line. You can see the direct responses they provided to each and every submission. So I think we're lucky that we've got very efficient and dedicated sustainability officers that got through them all, with the exception of that late report received from one of the town teams, which we met with the town team separately to run through that and provide a response as well.
I guess because Councillor Kontoshevsky's not here, it will the timing between when feedback comes in and when the reports come to council be considered as part of the community consultation policy that's being reviewed, and when is that going to be coming to a workshop?
Through you, Mayor Cole, there is a working group now established with a group of elected members who are working through a schedule of the different elements to the community consultation policy. We have, I forget when the next meeting is scheduled for that working group, but I think it's over the next few weeks, so I don't have the date to hand of when that policy will go back to a full council workshop.
The implementation plan, it's not a track changes version. Is there a track changes version, or is this effectively the same document that was advertised?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I don't think there were any substantive changes to those actions in that draft implementation plan.
One of the other things that was raised by Beaufort Street Network was that there wasn't specific additional funding for greening within town centres, and we discussed at the time that this is kind of covered under that broader greening plan budget. But I was wondering, there was a view expressed that there was a need for additional greening within our town centres, and I wasn't clear on the strategy around the greening plan of where we prioritise our spend. We've got funds on budget for next year. But I would have thought that we'd prioritise areas like town centres first, and so I'm just wondering, have we done everything we can in town centres now, or is there still more greening that's going to be undertaken in future years?
Through you, Mayor Cole, if I can take that. I'll need to take some of that question on notice, but what I will say is that the people in the Parks and Urban Green work closely with the place managers. So that's how we identify areas in town centres that require trees, that we can locate trees, and also work with the businesses so we can get the right location. So, but I'll take the rest of the question on notice if that's okay.
They also expressed a strong desire around planter boxes as well, which isn't really covered under the greening plan. But I was wondering, do we have any mechanisms by which they can be delivered within town centres?
Through Mayor Cole again, that's working through the place managers, and we do have some examples, and we have some budgets for town centres where planter boxes could be purchased and installed if that's what the businesses want.
Under the survey feedback, there was a few things that came under pedestrian safety and access, and bike and road infrastructure, around, I guess, suggesting making streets safer for cyclists and pedestrians, looking for us to, I guess, close off streets. We had quite an involved conversation about this last meeting with an unsuccessful amendment. I'm curious to know if the city will be considering those types of concepts as part of the integrated transport plan that is currently being considered.
Through you, Mayor Cole, the integrated transport plan is looking at how we can provide a higher amenity pedestrian and cycle environment where I guess there might be gaps in the current network where we don't have as high a provision, and can then work to address that over the number of years of implementing the integrated transport plan.
So this would consider as an option things like welcome statements to sort of effectively encourage traffic to flow around those residential streets, those local streets. Is that fair?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the detail of the integrated transport plan hasn't been finalised, so it may be that an action is included relating to entry statements if we think that's relevant to transport, or that we strengthen key links in particular areas to impact on the flow of people and cars.
I'll think about that one. Another thing that was encouraged by Beaufort Street Network was to include some advocacy with state government around electric/hybrid buses specifically for Beaufort Street, which is quite probably specific to that area. But does the city have a view around including that as a broader piece of advocacy around electric buses, but also trams and so forth as well across the city of Vincent?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the city doesn't currently have a council-adopted position on, I guess, transport-related advocacy. So although we're always looking to improve the current service level that we have, part of the integrated transport plan is to provide that strategic direction so that administration can then advocate more strongly on the city's behalf in relation to transport matters. In terms of the detail of whether that's for different types of technologies to be used or different links to be provided or different service levels to be provided, that would be detail that's worked out in the integrated transport plan.
I'll just foreshadow an amendment on that. Another topic that was raised was around how we're supporting solar panels within the community. There has been some discussion around that at the EAG as well, but I was hoping that administration could provide some details on that as well, just to provide that as feedback too.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I know that in the 2018-19 financial year, 18-19 financial year, we had the Environmental Advisory Group had identified that we're not seeing a very high uptake of solar. So we did some investigation, the sustainability officers did some investigation looking at what the barriers to achieving higher rates of solar uptake are. And that work ultimately, or part of that work found that we have a very high number of rentals in the city of Vincent, and so that was a potential barrier that tenants and landlords weren't wanting to put solar panels on their buildings because of the real or perceived financial cost and benefit. So as a result of finding out that information, we've put a bunch of information on our website around the benefits of providing solar and how you might go about doing that if you're either a landlord or a tenant.
That's all. Sorry, just as a follow-up to that question, is that information for business landlords and tenants as well as residential, or is it mainly aimed at residential?
Through Mayor Cole, I believe that it was mainly focused at residential but would apply to any sort of tenant-landlord situation.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on the SES? Okay. Just to flag with you, under item 9, motions of which previous notice has been given, just wanted to flag that I have emailed around a draft notice of motion, and apologies that it's not finalised, and just that is in relation to, just to flag publicly on the record, that is in relation to a current non-refundable application fee of $44 that we currently charge for residents who wish to place a skip bin on their adjoining verge, and the notice of motion is to amend the 2019-20 fees and charges to remove that $44 fee for skip bins on verges where the skip bin is in place for up to 14 days. So just to flag that one with you. This is really trying to differentiate between ongoing construction skip bins that are in place for a long time and can have an impact, as opposed to that more sporadic residential use. And also just to flag that I'm going to also propose a notice of motion in relation to activation of North Perth Common to call for expressions of interest for events to happen in that space. The city is planning a series of events, and I think that we could potentially build upon that, and the city has taken some community feedback about the sorts of events that the community would like to see in that space, and this is about really bolstering the events that can happen in that space. So that's another one coming forward. So there being no further business this evening, I will close the meeting at 7:43 p.m. Thank you.